Hi, Dawn. Welcome.
Hi, thank you.
Okay, welcome to the screen. Good afternoon, everyone, and good third Thursday. Welcome to ELC Talks Through an Equity Lens, coming to you in American Sign Language, Spanish, and English. I am Pamela Hollingsworth, and my pronouns are she, hers. I serve as the Senior Vice President of Strategic Initiatives and the Equity Institute for the Early Learning Coalition of Miami-Dade and Monroe counties. I'd like to begin today with a land recognition. I'd like to begin by taking a moment to elevate the Tequesta, Mississauga, and Seminole people, the indigenous people from whom the land that I am speaking to you from today was taken. Let's have a moment of silence, please. Thank you. And so we begin. Statues have long been a way to honor leaders, benefactors, heroes, and the war dead, giving them permanence and a three-dimensional presence. Over the years, they have come to mean many, many things to different people, including a way to remember, a work of art, or sometimes simply a place for pigeons to roost. But increasingly, some statues, particularly those honoring Confederate leaders or victories, and those connected with slavery, have become a flashpoint for many and have been removed or destroyed because of the pain, the suffering, or the oppression that they represent. This push, which has ebbed and flowed over the years, has recently gained renewed momentum, with statues either removed by protesters, removed by our government, or by private organizations. Before we move into the talk today, I'd like to take a moment to introduce our president and CEO of the Early Learning Coalition, Avelio Torres. Avelio is going to say a few words before we begin today's presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Just a quick welcome to everyone. Very excited about this afternoon's conversation. As you know, when we hold these cafes, these are community conversations to advance our knowledge. There's a lot going on. I was saying earlier, not only in our community and in our state, but in our country, but around the world. So we're trying to understand, the situation with these statutes a little bit better. And again, we're not a non-political organization. We are an organization that serves children and families, and we're trying to do that in the most sensitive way possible. And it's important for us to learn from the past and understand the future, right? It's 2021, so things are quite different than they were 100 years ago, 50 years ago. We have just an amazing speaker today that, I'm very excited to hear from. And again, we hope that we advance all of our knowledge about what is happening around our country and in our state and even in our own community, so that then we can do a better job at serving the children and families, and also many of the childcare providers who we work with. So that's what this conversation is about. And again, I'm going to turn it back over to Pam Hollingsworth, who is going to introduce our very excellent speaker. I'm sure that everyone will enjoy hearing from him. So thank you, Pam.
Thank you, Mr. Torres. So folks, today on this third Thursday in July, ELC Talks Through an Equity Lens invites you to consider the complex issues surrounding Confederate statues and monuments. And our guide today is Rudy Jean-Bart, historian, professor, and interim associate dean of academic affairs at Broward College. Rudy Jean-Bart is a native of Miami, Florida. He is the interim associate dean of the criminal justice area at Broward College. Prior to that, Rudy served as an assistant professor of history at the college's South Campus, where he taught American history and African American history. Mr. Jean-Bart was the 2015-2016 Broward College South Campus Professor of the Year. Mr. Jean-Bart currently serves as chair to Broward College's newly formed Advisory Council for the Advancement of Diversity, equity, and inclusion. And with that, Mr. Jean Bart, I happily pass you the virtual mic, and welcome to ELC Talks.
Thank you so much, Pamela. Really appreciate it. Thank you for your kindness, the invitation, extending the invitation. Really glad to be with you all. And so what I'm going to do now is share my screen. So good afternoon to all of you in Zoom land. I'm going to share my screen with you, and I have some slides and we'll go over some things. But really, I want this to be a dialogue, right? And so therefore, I'm going to share some things, but I'll be more than happy to answer your questions. So if you see me looking down, it's just me looking down at the phone to make sure I'm good on time. And so,
Mr. Jean Bart, my sincere apologies. The backstage is reminding me that all of our listeners today, please choose a language choice. There is a button on the far right side of your screen. Please choose English or Spanish. Thank you. And I'm muting.
no worries. Awesome. Awesome. And I will be mindful also of translation. So I'll be mindful of my pace today. And so now, one of the things that I want for us to think about is that America is a nation that is founded upon revolution. And one of the things I want you to think about also is the fact that when we often use the words revolution, it is often utilized in a context that suggests some good, right? So even though it is certainly defined as an overthrowing of a government, right, in order to form a new system. But what we recognize is quite often when individuals who are overthrowing a government and creating a new system are perceived as bad actors or individuals that already had some sense of power, we often refer that to a coup d'etat, right? So revolution is something that we often state when it comes to those who are marginalized or those who have been oppressed in some form or fashion, and them desiring to overthrow a system in order to create new liberties. So Haitian Revolution comes to mind. Cuba's War of Independence in the 1890s, where Jose Marti is popularizing Cuba Libre, comes to mind. America's revolution in the 1700s, when it comes to recognizing that they no longer wanted to be taxed without representation, therefore playing a large role in them revolting against England, comes to mind as well. But that context needs to be understood in the very beginning. Now, I want to share with you all a story about a man named James Armistead. When we're talking about American Revolution, and I promise you we're going to get to statues, I just think that context is really important. James Armistead was an enslaved man who wanted to participate in the American Revolutionary War, right? And as such, his slave master gave him permission to do so. He decides to therefore join the ranks of the Americans, and in particular was working for Marquis de Lafayette, the 19-year-old general from France, because France served as an ally to America. And it just so happened that Armistead allowed himself to be a spy. So he would go behind enemy lines and impose himself as a servant for the British. And it was him pretending to be a servant and being a spy, really, that gave him intel about the location of a particular place in Virginia, that being Yorktown. And so what you have is the Battle of Yorktown is really taking place because of the intelligence that was provided by James Armistead, this enslaved individual. Why is that key? Because Lord Cornwallis, the leader of the British efforts, one of the leaders of the British efforts, was stationed at Yorktown. And therefore, when they were able to capture Lord Cornwallis and his troops, that is what brought America its independence. That served as a final major battle. And that is because of an individual who was enslaved. Yet we hardly ever hear James Armistead's name being referenced when it comes to American history. We hardly ever hear his name being referenced when it comes to the Revolutionary War or the Revolutionary period. And also, He did not become free until 1787, 6 years later, after he had been a hero that really brought America its independence. That is an example of erasure, right? How the story quite often of African Americans is not included in the conversation of America. And that has to be taken into consideration in that conversation for today, which I've entitled Seceding from a Norm, right? So to secede means to break away from. You had 11 states that formed the Confederacy, and they seceded from the Union, that being America. They chose to separate themselves from America. Now, there's a few things I want for us to consider. One is that I think it's so fitting to talk about children, right? Considering the context of this organization. And that quite often, when it comes to movement, when it comes to social activism, young people are at the heart of that, right? And so when we're talking about removing of statues, one of the things that we have to take into consideration is what role do young people play in that? But also, when we're talking about the creation of statues, one also must take into consideration what role young people play into that, or the teachings of young people play into that, right? And so here you have a photo of a 15-year-old at the time named Claudette Colvin. Many people don't know who she is. If I were to simply say, well, someone who stopped or decided to not go to the back of the bus, who would that person be? People automatically assume or think of Rosa Parks, right? But one of the things that we have to be mindful of is this, and that is Claudette Colvin was someone who ends up, Claudette Colvin is someone who ends up 9 months before Rosa Parks deciding to not go to the back of the bus. It was March 2nd, 1955, and she was told to move to the back of the bus, and she refused to do so, right? And her reasoning is interesting. She explains that it was her constitutional right to sit where she was sitting, but then she also says something that's really fascinating, that Sojourner Truth, it felt as though, was pushing down on her, and Harriet Tubman was pushing down on the other side of her shoulders, saying, "Sit down, girl." She says, "I was glued to my seat." Now, context again is very key. March 2nd, 1955. March, of course, coming after February. It just so happens that Claudette Colvin had learned a significant amount of information as it related to, at that time, what was referred to as Negro History Week, right? Month, and eventually became Black History Month. And she learned about Sojourner Truth, and she learned about Harriet Tubman, and she learned about how African Americans had been oppressed and enslaved and how they overcame those instances. And so at 15 years old, she felt emboldened to make a stand. It was that knowledge that empowered her. It speaks to my favorite quote, or one of my favorite quotes, that before there is insurrection in the body, there is insurrection in the mind. In other words, before there is revolution that is lived in the physical, it must be intellectual first. She had to be empowered with the knowledge, and then she had to move forward with that knowledge. And that's what we saw on March 2nd, 1955. The reason why that is relevant is because when we're looking at this recent removal of a statue from Charlottesville, Virginia, not only of Robert E. Lee, but also should be stated of Thomas Stonewall Jackson as well, that the reason why that statue was removed was because 5 years ago, a 15-year-old by the name of Zion Bryant created a petition. Zion Bryant is someone who states the following in an op-ed that she recently wrote in Teen Vogue. She first states this: "I've had a lot of time to reflect on the concept of erasure, often feeling like I'm a part of a pattern for Black women who look, sound, and act like me." There's the erasure piece. So part of the inspiration is that I am erased quite often. One of the things she stated is that when she would go to these public places, spaces, and see in her own hometown these Confederate statues that she thought it would be unfair for other people to be uncomfortable in said spaces. These spaces are not just for some, but it's for everybody, right? Again, going back to this theme of revolution and liberty, right? I think about France's revolution and how from that there was a creation of the Declaration of the Rights of Man. And in it, it says liberty can only exist when it does not harm others. I'll say that one more time. Liberty exists only when it does not harm others. Now, the other thing that she articulates in this op-ed is I honor women like Claudette Colvin, who was also a 15-year-old Black girl, when she refused to give up her seat on a segregated bus in 1955. This is legacy. It is Claudette Colvin sowing a seed of revolution, dare I say, that ends up being planted into the soul of Ziona Bryant. Now, we take those things and we juxtapose it with the Confederacy, right? But before we even get there, there's some other things that we need to really think about when we're talking about erasure. One of them is a quote from Abraham Lincoln. And so many people, of course, President Lincoln, the 16th president of the United States, some call him, or many actually, the greatest president of all time. Many people see him as this great liberator, but I will submit to you it's more complicated than that. In taking a look at this quote, Lincoln was once quoted as saying, "I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and Black race. That I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people." And I will say, in addition to this, that there is a physical difference between the white and Black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. Pretty astounding quote when we think about who it is coming from, right? And why do I share that? Because again, we must understand that when it comes to slavery, there were 246 years of slavery. And therefore, you cannot separate the relationship that America had with Black labor as it relates to enslavement, and how America post-slavery still had a very tenuous relationship with those who are Black, simply because, in large part, there is this relationship of labor that had existed. And in other words, if you are not a respecter of the body, you probably are not going to be a respecter of the mind, and vice versa. It should be stated that Abraham Lincoln stated in his inauguration speech that he had no desire to touch slavery or to mess with slavery. It should also be stated that when he wrote the Emancipation Proclamation, and actually 100 days prior to that, which is most important, the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, he had only initially stated it to the 11 states who seceded and broke away. And also, had the South, the Confederacy, decided to end the war and therefore rejoin the Union, slavery would not have been touched. In other words, Lincoln's Emancipation or preliminary Emancipation Proclamation was more so of the following. When it says this, right, where it says that if there is no slavery, right, then there is no, or rather, if there is no rejoining of the Union, then there will be essentially an end of slavery, right? And so what it brings to the question is, was the Confederacy an act of revolution? Based upon the fact that Lincoln stated in his inauguration that he did not want to touch slavery, based upon the fact that even after the war, you had it where there was a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation that gave them the opportunity to rejoin the Union without touching slavery, one would suggest that it is not based upon an act that is revolutionary. Something else for us to consider is that people often say, Well, the Confederacy fought and separated itself from the Union simply because it was a desire, if you will, to protect states' rights, that it has nothing to do with slavery. However, take a look at this. Vice President of the Confederate States, Alexander Stephens, said that the cornerstone of the new government rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and moral condition, right? So now here it is where you have it, where there's phraseology or there's wording from the Vice President of the Confederate States of America himself saying, no, the cornerstone of this government rests upon this truth that Black people are inferior and that subordination is their natural and moral condition. So now, when it comes to this evolution of these statues and how they began popping up in various places, the question has to be asked, did it happen immediately after the Civil War? And the answer to that is no. A large part of the statues and monuments that we see, as well as schools that have been named after Confederate soldiers and generals, streets that have been named after Confederate generals and soldiers and the like, are in large part due to an organization that was founded in 1894, that being the United Daughters of the Confederacy. These were women who were descendants, whether they be daughters or granddaughters of Civil War veterans. Now, one of the other things that has to be taken into consideration is the spirit of activism among women at this time, especially considering that women were not granted the right to vote until 1920. And so there was a sense and a semblance of activism that was definitely alive and well in the 1890s. Many of it being the activism towards suffrage movement and getting women the right to vote. But you had women in the South who also had their own sense of passion, and that was the United Daughters of the Confederacy. So much so that by the time that the First World War began, there were approximately 100,000 members of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Now you have to remember that World War I began in 1914. It was in 1915 that there was a movie called Birth of a Nation, which was created by D.W. Griffith. And with Birth of a Nation, what it did is it introduced the minstrelsy to so many people, right? The idea of whites painting their faces black, mimicking black stereotypes. And the film in and of itself was one in which you would be able to see, one of which you'll be able to see where whites are painting their faces black and they're mimicking blacks post-Reconstruction or during the Reconstruction period, taking over government and being belligerent and being ignorant. And all of this was intentional in creating a certain kind of narrative. So now, what saves the day according to this film? The Ku Klux Klan saves the day. They arrest power from those who are black and they bestow power again to white Southerners, and they are portrayed as heroes. It is therefore not a surprise that in the 1920s, you had members of government who were part of the Ku Klux Klan, and you eventually had a membership of about 1 million people when it came to the Ku Klux Klan. That is narrative shifting. The United Daughters of the Confederacy were doing the same thing. They wanted to intentionally shape and create a narrative. They knew that creating monuments would do that. They knew that they also wanted to investigate textbooks and literally have it be that in these textbooks that children themselves would read, that the narrative would be that slavery was not the main cause of the Civil War, that many of the slave masters were benevolent and kind to their slaves, and that this was a lost cause. Lost cause, meaning that the only reason why the Confederacy lost was because they were outnumbered, but what they were standing for was indeed righteous. This was the doing of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And so what we found is different information and new information that celebrates the Confederacy, even though the Confederacy, it must be reminded, was not technically revolutionary in a positive way and separated itself from America. And even though that was the case, my apologies. And even though that was the case, one of the things that we find is the following, that this narrative exists to celebrate and honor those who lost their lives in the Confederacy as though they were courageous heroes. And so we find a beginning of an erecting of statues, hundreds of which take place beginning in the 1890s, going into the early 1900s. That was intentional. I also think about schools like in Jacksonville, Florida. Up until recently in Jacksonville, 2014 to be exact, there was a Nathan Bedford Forrest High School. Now, originally, the high school had been slated to be named something else when it came out in 1959, but it was the United Daughters of the Confederacy that gathered together and made sure that the school was named after Nathan Bedford Forrest. Up until recently in Hollywood, Florida, where I used to live, there was a Nathan Bedford Forrest Street, and it would go through primarily Liberia section of Hollywood, which is predominantly Black. Who is Nathan Bedford Forrest? Nathan Bedford Forrest is the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. Even today in Nashville, there is a tall Nathan Bedford Forrest statue. And last year, government in Nashville, or Tennessee rather, had the ability to create plants, or rather uplift plants, to hide the image of that statue on highways so that those who are driving on highways would not be able to see it. And they denied it, right? Government officials said, no, we still want that statue to be very much seen. Why is that important? Because many of these individuals in state and local government, they were taught from teachers who were taught by other teachers, who were taught by other teachers of a very limited scope of the Civil War that praised the Confederacy and did not bring into light the fact that the Confederacy was birthed out of enslavement. Up until recently, even in Biloxi, Mississippi, on the Beauvoir plantation, there are Civil War reenactments in which, in the reenactment, the South is seen as the winner. All of this is done to create and shape a narrative that is supportive of the Confederacy. But the thing that we have to consider is, yes, history needs to be remembered in order for us to make sure that we're mindful of not repeating the mistakes of the past. But a critical question I would like for the audience to consider is, does a monument, in particular monuments that stand extremely tall and have immense girth to them, monuments that really serve as a testament or really as a celebratory act of a particular figure, is that merely remembrance, or does it go beyond the pale of remembrance? In other words, if we were to be in Germany and found some statues and monuments that were referencing those who were part of Nazis, would many people see that as merely a remembrance of history, not a glorification of it? I'm not sure that we would, right? But I get it. There's a conversation that needs to be had about culture, right? And how people may feel as though their culture is being erased. So in one instance, you have individuals who feel like they're being erased. Zion Bryant says, as a Black woman, I feel a sense of erasure. I don't want to feel uncomfortable when I'm going into Charlottesville and I have to see a statue in my hometown. But then there are others who will say, but wait a minute, there is some sense of erasure of Southern culture, which is an interesting thing to take into consideration. The thing, though, that I would want us to think about is this also. and that is that we must remember that the reason why the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, which took place in 2017, it took place because of Ziona Bryant and her petition to remove the statue. It was individuals who saw themselves the potential of the statue being removed, determining that they're going to go to Charlottesville and have this protest. And what was their reaction? It was not intellectual debate. It was not to try to get a sense of understanding, but instead it was more so moving forward with the ideology that there should only be a certain group of people whose history or whose culture should be magnified. And some may say, well, is that truly the case? Well, think about the chant that was being stated during that rally. You will not replace us. You will not replace us. But there are those again who will say, we can't erase Southern culture. But I also want to remind us this, that Black people are Southern too. And we have to think about it, right? What does it mean to be Southern? And beyond that, what does it mean to be American? And if we're being honest, part of the tough reality of dealing with American history, which is not an easy history to digest, I would never suggest that it is, right? Is that we have to remember that for the first several decades of its inception as a country, and for the first couple of 100 years of its inception as a landmass of colonies, that there was a group of people who were born in America who were enslaved, who were seen as property and therefore seen as not human. And if you're not seen as human, your voices often is not being heard. So in the midst of this conversation around statues, we have to start really analyzing this question. What does it mean to be American? Is it really and truly something that is a collective? Is it really about a nationhood full of voices and diverse voices and perspectives? Yes, but also a diversity when it comes to race, a diversity when it comes to ethnic origin, and the whole entire gamut, right? I want us to think critically about us really unifying as a nation as we engage in these kinds of conversations, and really think critically about the role of the Confederacy and whether or not it was around slavery. Because there had been a narrative created by the UDC, United Daughters of Confederacy, that intentionally undermine the role of slavery. Last couple of things I want us to think about is, so for the last year plus, we've been dealing with COVID-19. And one of the things that we often find, and I share this example quite often when I'm talking about matters of race, is that for some people, it was easy to tell whether or not they had COVID, right? They had displayed symptoms. And so you had these displayed symptoms and it was clear, maybe I need to go to a doctor and get checked, and eventually, of course, get tested, and we were able to move into the phase of rapid testing. But the reason why the coronavirus spread as viciously as it did is because many people were asymptomatic. They didn't feel it. They didn't assume that they had COVID-19. They assumed that everything was fine. And I suggest to you all that quite often in these conversations around race, the reason why racism has been prevalent various times in America is because many people have felt as though I'm not racist, or I'm not on the side of racism, or this is not racial, this is asymptomatic of race. It's not a conversation of race. But in doing so, we have never fully dealt with racism in a holistic way in this nation. We've had a very asymptomatic approach to it. And I hope in these dialogues and conversations that we don't do that any longer, that we have a deeper dive into various symptoms and how this impacts our children. Because lastly, what we teach our children, especially now, is so critical. And narratives are being shaped and formed that eventually our children will become adults and will hold on to these narratives, and it will become even more difficult to take away those narratives from them if we don't act now. I look forward to your questions. Thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you, Professor Jean Bart. You certainly have given us a lot to think about. And I'll share just briefly for the audience, when Rudy came into the backstage today, we asked about the last two slides, and I said, we're thinking there's a deep allegory created, relating to that, and you did not disappoint. So thank you for that. You spoke so eloquently about the need for there to be a united nation and shared purpose. Talk to us a little more about what that balance could look like. How do, for those who may support the removal of Confederate statues and monuments, renaming of schools and streets, etc., how do we balance what we take away with what we then give back and achieve as a united country?
That's a really great question. So as an academician, I am very pro-intellectual conversation and debate. I think one of the things that I find really concerning about America, modern day especially, is I find that we are moving away from intellectual conversations. I think part of that is actually captured in the way in which the news operates today. So quite often you have opinion makers, and I give you an example. When I look at how elections are covered, it is often operatives and strategists from both political parties, rather than impartial, neutral, intellectual minds around politics having these kinds of conversations. And so what happens though is that quite often I find lately that people are suggesting that commentary and a notion that is not supportive of unity or not supportive of recognizing how people are being marginalized and oppressed, that is somehow intellectual or trying to move away from the intellectual conversation. And that is not, right? And so I have this t-shirt that has from with a James Baldwin quote, and I'll paraphrase here, that he suggests that we have a right to debate and have a conversation, but not at the risk of my humanity. And so what unity looks like, being a true nationhood, is going back to that Declaration of Rights of Man commentary, which is the desire to not harm others, right? The desire to create a collectivity and saying, you know what, we are as human beings deserving of certain kinds of rights and certain kinds of things that don't cause as infringement upon other people. And one of the things I think that we have to take a look at is this idea of comfort versus humanity. So if I am a Southerner, a white Southerner in particular, and I am a descendant of a Confederate soldier, and I see the removal of the statue as something that is horrendous, right? Then that's something that could be discussed and debated. But that person is going through a sense of discomfort. It is not an attack on their humanity. It is simply saying, really take a hard look at what historically actually happened, right? But if you're a Black person and you are going to that Black Southerner and you're in that park and you're seeing this statue and you're seeing it as a celebratory act, because that is what these statues were, right? They were not formed for the UDC or cultivated by the UDC and others as means for just merely remembrance of a time past, but actually celebration, right? Then you're seeing this statue as a celebration of an individual who literally owned slaves, right? And that becomes a bit problematic. And so for that Black Southerner, it's not about this issue of it's a discomfort, you're attacking my comfort. No, it's an issue about my humanity, about how a time in which my ancestors were not seen as human and literally treated as though they were not human, you're celebrating that individual, right? And so I think when we're looking at creating a truly united America, it is for us to have a different interpretation of what America is, right? In the sense that we have to recognize that America and a nationhood is about collective healing. It's about collective forward progress. And it's really about seeing something through a particular lens. And I give this example, if I may. I'm of Haitian descent. And in Haiti, there's a lot of colorism, right? Those who are lighter hue, those who are referred to as mulat, right? Those who are mulatto. And quite often there are economic implications around the distinction of color. Yet there is a shared Haitian experience, right? We love bonham peze, fried plantain. I don't care if you are wealthy and mulatto. I don't care if you're poor and of a darker hue. There's a shared experience. And I find it interesting that in America, there have been instances where when Black folk have articulated some of their frustrations, that people have said, well, if you don't like it here, go back home, as if this isn't their home. There's a history of individuals in the early 1900s, Black individuals who fought in World War I, came home to America, were in their uniforms and literally lynched in their uniforms. That suggests a detachment from Americanness when you are Black, and that is very perplexing. And so I think a unified America says, regardless of race and color, we are an ethnic people that, yes, we may have some of our ideological differences, but we should not expound upon those differences or trumpet those differences at the stake of each other's humanity.
Thank you for that. And thank you for that eloquent response. I've done quite a bit of examination of polls across the nation relating to the removal of Confederate statues. And I found some things that were pretty uniform. One is that the vast majority of people that were polled felt expressed an interest in the removal of the statues, felt that that was the way that we should be going. And at the same time, were concerned about the loss of the statues. So there were some questions as to whether or not special museums or special places should be erected. I remember just very briefly at the age of 17, which was more than 50 years ago, in my first trip to Paris, I remember being on bus tours and seeing historic statues that had been desecrated with, that's my term, with graffiti. I don't know the history, but I remembered feeling a sense of sadness when I saw that. How do we find that balance with removal? What happens when a statue comes down? What is the right role, the right place for that statue?
So I think that's interesting, right? I think for me personally, statues are often seen as celebratory. I think that what I find interesting is that when it comes to Civil War, and I'm speaking from the lens of a guy who was a college professor, and so it's always interesting to see my students and to analyze what they were taught in K through 12, right? And from a standpoint of history, I have to be honest, and I say this with love, my students often are not taught a whole lot when it comes to history. Part of it, I think, is not maybe an issue of whether or not something was taught. Maybe it was the way in which it was taught that might have not, been alluring to some students. But what I'm saying all that to say that I do think that there needs to be some remembrance around what occurred in the Civil War. That's absolutely critical and important. I'm not sure that statues are the means to do that, right? What I find interesting is that what a lot of people have not been talking about in this whole removal of statues in Charlottesville is that right now it's still, in some place in the state, and eventually it'll be moved elsewhere. But there have been 10 groups that have articulated interest in getting those statues. And it'll be interesting to see what those 10 groups, or if any of them, would do with the statue, right? And so what we may have on our hands is really kind of like musical chairs with the statues, where it's not a matter of you're merely removing it from this particular public space and taking away from, public spaces in general, but actually going to another public space in another state, that they may be more friendly to the idea of Confederate statues. So I am in agreement that there needs to be remembrance. But for me personally, I think statues often serve as a means of celebration. And I think it elicits a different kind of reaction. And I think we have to also deal with the fact that many people in the South still have a certain fondness around the Confederacy. And one other thing I'll point out too is this, that in many of these reenactments where the South wins a battle, right? You have to start analyzing critically, what would that mean if the Confederacy had won the Civil War, right? And are many of these Southerners suggesting, well, we're glad that we lost the Civil War, but we're just honoring those who fought it? Like that wouldn't make sense, right? And so there has to be an honest dialogue that for many people in the South, these celebrations and these statues are representative of a desire and wish that the Civil War outcome had been something different. And if it had been something different, it would have meant a continuation of enslavement.
Thank you. Thank you. Professor, University of North Carolina has been very much in the news over the past couple of weeks in relationship to tenure and Nicole Hannah-Jones and her association, her work inside of the 1619 Project. While reading that, it brought up the memories of Silent Sam and the deep and ongoing controversy about the removal of that particular statue. And of course, Silent Sam was standing at the entrance of one of the greatest state universities in the country. Before we move to the question in the chat box, do you have anything to say about Silent Sam and maybe aligning that in any way with the recent tenure conversation?
Yeah, I think that when it comes to all of it, whether it be Silent Sam and the tenure conversation, I think one of the things that we have to be mindful of is, again, going to this idea of not removing intellectual debate and being honest about what is intellectual debate and what is more so appraising of a particular ideology or politicization around a particular ideology. And so one of the things I think about is how there is some contention around, for example, Nicole Hannah-Jones' 1619 Project, which is fine. And I think that's open for debate. The problem had been the narrative around that impacts various things, is around this idea that this is somehow, some way going to make children not patriotic and not love America, rather than having a historical and intellectual debate about what role did slavery play in the American Revolutionary period, right? And I think that that's interesting, that again, harkens back to United Daughters of Confederacy, where what we're seeing about us today is a desire to protect a certain kind of imagery, because there's a fear that children may have a negative perspective on America. But I would posit that actually for America to have an honest reckoning would make America even more endearing to all children, no matter the age.
Nicely put. Thank you very much. And as we can, our final question, one of my colleagues, Dacieli, thank you for your question that is in the chat box. And I think you alluded, giving us the rich history lesson and making those connections for us today, I think kind of lays the foundation for the question that has been posed in the chat box. I'm actually going to jump at Dacieli. I'm going back to you. My colleague Belinda is asking, short of teaching a history lesson, what is a practical way to sway people from thinking Confederate monuments are an homage or an homage to states' rights?
So I think a good way to do that is to ask a question. To ask the person to give another example of an appropriate statue of individuals who were participatory in the oppression of a people. where else would that have been appropriate? Would it be appropriate in Germany? Would it be appropriate in Cambodia? Would it be appropriate in Darfur? Where would it be appropriate where we would say, here's a statue that is honoring individuals that were fighting to protect a system that oppressed individuals? And I think that becomes an interesting conversation, right? It is not one that is, and again, I think part of it is the tone has to be one that is non-judgmental, which is really difficult to be at times when we have these kinds of conversations. But I find the Socratic method to be very powerful, that when you phrase questions, rather than just merely making comments, it gets people to kind of be aware of some of the own miscued, misguided perspectives that they've had, right? And then also, again, maybe not giving a history lesson, but asking them, well, how did these statues come to be? And that'll be interesting to see if they know that history, because what's so important in talking about the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and they were not alone, right? There were other organizations as well, but that there was an intentionality around narrative shaping. And I think one of the things that is somewhat interesting is that there is this fear around, and I'm sure we'll get to that question in a minute, critical race theory, that there's going to be a narrative shaping around something that may create a pro-Black hysteria. But to suggest that that theory cannot even be mentioned in K through 12, even though it really wasn't taught in K through 12 to begin with, does bring in the question, well, does that create another narrative, right? And that, I think, is an interesting conversation to have. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you for that. And our final question in our last couple of minutes does relate to critical race theory. And one of our participants is questioning why it's such a controversy, and this probably builds on the statement that you've just now made.
Right. I think that it's a controversy because there is a particular fear that exists. And it's so interesting because I don't think that had Nicole Hannah-Jones written the 1619 Project, and by the way, it should be stated, actually, she did not write it alone, right? She was an editor of this project. But had the 1619 Project not come out, had George Floyd and then the responsive protests to that had not taken place, I don't think that this would have entered into the various legislations that it has in various states. And I think that there is this fear that exists that if we have an autopsy of American history, that it is going to spark something that is not going to be flattering to America. But again, it does beg the question, what does it mean to be American, right? And if we can't be honest about, and I love the fact that this program began with honoring the indigenous people of this land and whose land this was. If we can't be honest about this land being taken away from indigenous folk, if we can't be honest about the enslavement of African people, if we can't be honest about unfair labor practices that many of which involved immigrants going as far back even to the, beyond indentured servitude, but even going into the 19th century, the Gilded Age and beyond, then it actually does the opposite. And I say that as someone who has taught history for several years, that when many of my students learn these things for the first time ever, there's a couple of reactions. One is, why have I never heard of this story before, right? Even though it's public information. And then they become even more mindful of certain things, and it makes America more suspicious rather than it making America more flattering. And so the truth is something that I believe frees a lot of us, right? And so if we enter into a realm of honesty, that is where the healing can begin. One of the examples that I'll use is I am both a husband and a father. Both of those positions are very humbling experiences. If I'm of the mindset that I have to always protect my ego and how I look, there cannot be healing in my household. There are moments where I have to say to my wife, you were right, I was wrong, I'm sorry. How can I repair this infraction? There are moments where my son, I must model to him a behavior that says redemption is possible. Daddy might have hurt you in some way, or daddy might have said this, or you might have said this to daddy, but nothing is going to separate us from our togetherness and our love. And that is where transformation takes place. It does not take place when we're hiding from the truth, right? And so if that is true for my own household, it is definitely true for the household known as it.
Thank you. Thank you for that. What an enlightening conversation this has been today. Professor Rudy Jean-Bart, Associate Dean, we thank you for the reminder that discussions that are grounded in facts, as well as calm conversations, as well as restorative practices, are really the most productive conversations. And this has really been, I think, an important hour for so many of us. And I want to thank you for choosing to spend this time today. I see a colleague of mine referring to this as an excellent program. Some saying beautifully said. Thank you. Dacieli, thank you for your reference to Nelson Mandela. Lots of great comments in our chat box. And I want to take just a moment as we close to thank all of you for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you on the next third Thursday, which is Thursday, August 19th at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time for ELC Talks Through an Equity Lens. And at that time, we are privileged to elevate the conversation around the learning loss for children in marginalized communities relating to the COVID-19 pandemic. I hope that all of you will leave a parting comment and a resounding thank you to Mr. Jean-Bart in our chat box today. It's been such a pleasure spending this hour with you. And these words that we always close our ELC Talks sessions with ring particularly true today. And so we end today the way we always do, and that is by simply saying, after today, you can choose to look away, but you cannot say that you did not know. And on behalf of the Early Learning Coalition of Miami-Dade and Monroe counties, and from our end of the internet to yours, I'm wishing you a beautiful day. Namaste. Many, many thanks to Professor Rudy Jean-Bart, Interim Dean at Broward College. Thank you, resoundingly thank you. And I hope all of you have a wonderful Thursday. And Rudy, what a pleasure it's been to be with you today.
Likewise, always a joy. Thank you so much. And I saw Nichelle. Shout out to Nichelle.
Yes, is Nichelle in the chat box? I sent her the invitation. She should be. Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Signing off.
Wow.
We'll talk.